Hello and welcome to the online symposium Art and Humanity, What is Possible? My name is Pascal Hufschmid. I'm the director of the International Red Cross and Red Crescent Museum, and I'm here standing with Enckell Julliard, Director of Cultural Development at the University of Art and Design here in Geneva.
Thank you for taking time to join us today. Together we're going to explore the complex and fascinating relationship between art and humanitarian action, two fields of expertise which seldomly interact with one another.
We're very passionate about this question. We're standing here in our new exhibition concerned 30 artists on humanitarian issues, which is currently being installed. And it's in the context of this exhibition that we developed the online symposium. Every Tuesday afternoon in May, we will have the opportunity to learn from leading experts all around the world on this complex and fascinating relationship between art and humanitarian action. So throughout the sessions, please feel free to always use the chat box to ask your questions. And this afternoon, we'll be listening to 3 different panelists.
So every session will have a specific theme. Today the theme is learning. How can artists and humanitarian learn from one another? We will start with Ariane Koek, international curator and independent consultant based in London. In her paper, Real Feelings, the artist as visionary, she asks if artists should not be considered as humanitarian agents.
A fascinating question, and we'll follow up with Francesco Zucconi. He will attempt to understand why Caravaggio paintings in Italy were presented or requested for display on different occasions in the context of public humanitarian events. He is an assistant professor at the IUAV University of Venice.
And finally, Olivier Chow will address the relationship between trauma and representation in the work of the Chilean artist Alfredo Jaar, in particular his installation dedicated to the Rwandan genocide. Olivier Chow is the founder and owner of the Lausanne-based gallery Foreign Agent, dedicated to contemporary African art and design.
So today with you and throughout the entire symposium, we decided to experiment and to try something new. So we've invited the Swiss artist Gilles Furtwängler to co-create with you and with us a new artwork throughout the symposium. So he'll be here for a 10-minute session. We really invite you to take part and to send your material on our website. You'll find all the necessary information. So please don't forget to ask your questions throughout the conversations using the chat box.
Gilles Furtwängler is an artist who works with words, reading, writing, performance. He has had numerous exhibitions in Switzerland and abroad, and his gallery here in Geneva is Galerie Skopje.
So before we get started, Julia and I wanted to thank all our partners. Special thanks to our partner Philippe Stoll, whom you'll meet later on in different sessions. And a big thank you also to my colleague Pierre-Antoine Possat for coordinating and producing the entire symposium.
The symposium is the result of a partnership between the International Red Cross Museum, the RCRC, the Geneva Red Cross, and the HED Geneva, the School of Art and Design. Thank you to all our partners for their enthusiasm and support.
And of course, a big thank you to all of our speakers for your time, all the expertise you're going to share with us, and thank you for being here and taking part. So enjoy the ride, and we'll see you later during the live Q&A session at the end of the presentations.
Hello, Real Feelings, Artists as Radical Agents. The global pandemic has accelerated society's intimacy with technology at an unprecedented rate due to increased usage by individuals and governments. Technology for the immediate future is the glue that is keeping us all connected with others as well as ourselves. It is the crucial tool with which we share, communicate, and explore our real feelings with others in this new era of social distancing. It is also a crucial tool for the suppression of the pandemic. Countries like China, South Korea, and Singapore managed the first wave of the pandemic last year by using mass surveillance and data collection to track and control their populations. Technology already embedded and interwoven into the fabric of their societies. According to the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, which has created the AI Global Surveillance Index, at least 75 out of 176 countries globally are actively using AI technologies for surveillance purposes. City platforms, facial recognition systems, and smart policing. And their survey also shows that it's actually the liberal democracies who are major users of AI surveillance. Technology now is right at the heart of humanitarian debates. When does surveillance for the population and their safety and health become an invasion of privacy and control? Who controls the data? Why and how? And at what cost to liberty and human freedom, which apparently are part of liberal democracies? Those are just some of the questions which are being raised. Now, last year, during the pandemic, I co-curated the exhibition Real Feelings, Emotion and Technology with my co-curators, Sabine Himmelsbach, the director of Heck, Basel, where the exhibition opened, and Angelique Spannings, director of Move Hybrid Art Centre in Eindhoven, where the exhibition is going to open again at the end of May. This presentation is actually going to look at some of the artists featured in our exhibition and use them as a way of looking at points in the Anticipate part of this conference. The 2 points are what kind of reflections art enables us to make, and how and why artists are critical agents, I would argue, rather than visionaries, for humanitarian principles in society. So if you wait till the end, I will outline why I take exception to the term visionaries, even more so in the 21st century when we urgently need change. So we begin at the beginning of the exhibition. So at the beginning of our exhibition, Real Feelings, you will find Vibe Check, 6 screens on the wall at the gallery entrance. The artwork is by the American artists Lauren McCarthy and Cal McDonald, and makes the visitors immediately aware of the surveillance society we live in now. There's an artificial intelligence system which is tracking your emotions as you go round the exhibition and as you leave it too. The 6 screens on the wall show the AI's categorization of the emotions of the people in the exhibition. For example, surprise, sadness, anger, contempt, even disgust, or even glee. There are cameras planted throughout the exhibition using the facial recognition software. When the visitor leaves, they see themselves and their interactions with other audience members categorized and grouped under an emotion. Is that accurate? Is that how you really felt? Do you agree with this classification? Is that really what's happening? Vibe Check very clearly exposes the invasive nature of technology which uses artificial intelligence. The artists actually make the audience part of the artwork, thus involving them directly in seeing for themselves some of the mistakes and the biases within the system. And that's through experience, which is the power of art. So the audience becomes part of the understanding themselves of the implications of the technology in surveillance society. In surveillance society and in society in general, as technology accelerates, there are new gadgets like this, the hat bee, which says that it can claim and control the emotions which we feel. There's also AI facial recognition software. Both the gadget and AI facial recognition software are part of the affective emotions market, which in 2023 will be worth $26 billion US. It is the latest trend in Silicon Valley. Now, facial recognition software relies on the categorization of emotions on our faces. You saw how a system of categorizing emotions on our face at the beginning in the poster to the Real Feeling show. Here it is again. It is actually an artwork by the Dutch artist Coralie Vogelaar. The piece shows American psychologist Paul Ekman's facial coding system, which is based also on his theory of 6 basic human emotions. Facial recognition technology is actually trained on this system. In the heavily contested area of the classification of emotions in psychology, there are thought to be far more emotions than just 6. And of course, our bodies, not just our faces, show and express emotions too. But that is not the only limitation. The tech AI facial coding systems only recognize happiness, for example, on white faces. It is inherently biased racially. As MIT Media Lab researcher Joy Buolamwini has shown, and as the Netflix documentary Coded Bias makes clear, technology replicates the biases in society. It is only as good as the people who input the information. Emotion recognition software has limited detection also in white faces too, as the Swiss artist Christophe Lambelet demonstrates in his photographic work. Happiness is only the true emotion. The only emotion that AI can truly identify on white faces with 100% accuracy is happiness. Facial recognition systems, however, are not the only mode of surveillance in the 21st century and data gathering. Cecil B. Evans, her piece, How Happy a Thing Can Be, partly evokes another growing trend in technology, the Internet of Things, or IoT. The Internet of Things describes the network of physical objects, things, or objects that are embedded with sensors, software, and other technologies. And they can be inside our appliances, in our kitchens, or anywhere. And they're there for the purpose of connecting and exchanging data with other devices and systems over the internet. By the end of 2018, there were an estimated 22 billion Internet of Things connected devices being used in the world. And forecasts suggest that by 2030, there'll be around 50 billion, creating a massive web of interconnected devices sharing data. So Cecil B. Evans' piece, How Happy a Thing Can Be, actually focuses on mundane personal things, a comb, a screwdriver, and a pair of scissors, and they perform a dance to the death that implies that they're being pushed to their limits, that they have emotions too. One of the many messages of this complex piece is that we may be now endowing objects with humanity whilst losing our own. Artist number 4, Lucy McRae, describes herself as speculative designer, sci-fi artist, and body architect. Her practice focuses on the implications of technology for humanity. With a series of works, Lucy reflects on the fact that we often spend more time with technology than we do with other human beings. For our exhibition, Lucy realised a new commission, Solitary Survival Raft, which she created when she was alone during lockdown in 2020 in her LA studio, with us curators joining her in on the process on Zoom. Lucy created an inflatable, responsive, breathing sculpture that invites the audience to crawl into it for safety and be embraced by its structure. The whole colour scheme of the new work speaks of imminent disaster and how the potential for rescue when reality is shipwrecked may be just only from technology. As we crawl into the raft's embrace, it inflates and then its skin deflates around us, holding us and becoming our second skin. Can technology's embrace replace that of human touch? Will that be all we have left when the world ends? And are we investing more in technology than we are in human beings? And basically, rather than solving the immense challenges we face as a species. And finally, in the video piece called Terminal Beach by the artists collective Troika, a furry robot is relentlessly chopping down the last tree on Earth in the deserted landscape. The robot's movements were created by tracking in real life human movements, which were then rendered. The robot has been carried and programmed by humans to carry out its actions in this fictional video piece, just as they are in real life. The piece shows that when humanity moves away from any connection with humans and nature, aided and embedded by technology, then everything suffers, including the planet. We are programming even technology for destruction, which is following our lead. Technology is only as humanitarian and caring as the humans who program it. For me, this piece also brings up another very important question and point. In the 21st century, I would argue humanitarianism cannot be considered without planetarianism. The two go hand in hand. Humans are not alone. After all, they are part of the intricate web of interconnectedness and interdependence of all beings and of all matter. And this is an idea which the new materialist philosophers and thinkers Karen Barad, Donna Haraway, and Rosa Braidotti insist. And with that comes what Karen Barad calls responsibility, the ability to respond to and with the environment and ecology and other beings, whether they're sentient or not. We are all intra-connected. Human rights, I would suggest, in the face of the climate emergency, has to be now importantly co-considered with environmental rights. They are intimately interconnected. This is in a world which earlier this year announced that water, one of the Earth's natural resources and a fundamental condition for supporting human life, is now being valued, bought and sold on the Wall Street Stock Exchange. So I hope with the example of just some of the artists in our exhibition, Real Feelings, I have shown how artists are radical agents in our society. In the case of our exhibition, they investigate and explore the implication of technology on society, ecology, the individual and communities. And these are just a few of the examples. And before I finish this presentation, as I promised, I'm going to outline why I take exception to the term visionary being used to describe artists, particularly in the 21st century, and in relation to humanitarianism. Artists may be seen to be visionary in some cases, because after all, they see and create representations and visions beyond the known. But I would argue calling artists radical agents is far more appropriate rather than visionaries in the 21st century. Radical comes from the Latin radix, meaning root, showing a material connection with the environment and ecology around. And that is what we exist, and it provides the fullest part of any picture. It's our context for survival and growth. The word visionary was first used in the Enlightenment in the 17th century, and the Enlightenment was part of the way of thinking which privileged sight and observation as a way of knowing, and the triumph of the individual also over community. The works of these artists I showed does not only involve vision, sight, but involves triggering many other senses too. Another objection is that the Enlightenment promoted the mind-body split. Descartes' "I think, therefore I am" in Western European culture. With this came a split from a sensuous, fully embodied connection with environment, communities, and others in the world around us, which became displaced as other or nature with a capital N. The ego in the individual became center stage and the source of all knowing. Everything was to be seen through the I or I of the individual. Now, artists as radical agents return and reconnect us to our fully embodied sensuous selves, their work touching our hearts, our physiologies, as well as our minds. And that is why and how art is so powerful. It is a change agent. The word agent is deliberately chosen too because it suggests action, doing, agency, change, whereas visionary is much more passive. It's something which happens to you, or it's something you see, observe, but you don't get involved with. Yes, art enables us to feel, intuit, imagine, and think beyond our own experiences. And so in that sense, you could say it's visionary. But the best artists and their work actually work actively on us, both internally and or externally, through our hearts, bodies, senses, and minds. And they can make change happen inside a person. So artists, I would argue, are radical agents of connection in the fabric of being. But that is not all, and there's more in this whole argument. In her book, Braiding Sweetgrass, Indigenous Wisdom, Scientific Knowledge and the Teaching of Plants, Robin Wall Kimmerer, Professor of Environmental Biology at Syracuse, New York, and a member of the Potawatomi Nation, embraces, for example, the notion that plants and animals are our oldest teachers. She says that we should engage with them with all the senses we have available to us. Planetarianism, and in this case, plantarianism, and humanitarianism working hand in hand. Drawing on her life as an Indigenous scientist, Kimmerer shows how other living beings, asters and goldenrod, strawberries and squash, salamanders and algae, are sensuous feelings things too. This is reflected in language, in the grammar of animacy used by her nation. All beings are interconnected. Humans don't exist by, in, and of themselves. And I would argue this is what art actually reminds us. It actually reconnects us to these roots in the human experience about us being connected and beyond ourselves. And that is why I would argue artists are radical agents, rooted in a present past time across time and space and all matter and being. My real feelings are that artists can show us the way of being radical agents in the 21st century. And in fact, that's what we should all be aspiring to be.
Good morning, everyone, and thanks for giving me the opportunity to take part in this fantastic conference. With this talk, I'd like to present a research that I've been developing over the past years. I'll offer a quick walkthrough of some of the issues I've developed in a book that came out in 2018 for Palgrave Macmillan and is entitled Displacing Caravaggio, Art, Media, and Humanitarian Visual Culture. I'll show you a few paintings and make a few references to contemporary photographs and communications that, mainly due to copyright issues, I don't have the opportunity to show here. In the summer of 2014, a painting by Caravaggio was the focus of negotiations between several institutions. The work in question was the 7 Works of Mercy which Caravaggio delivered to the Confraternity of the Church of Pio Monte della Misericordia in Naples on January 9, 1607. The aim was to show the 7 Works of Mercy at the exhibition stand organized by the Italian branch of Caritas Internationalis, one of the most important NGOs in the world, on the occasion of the Universal Exhibition held in Milan in 2015. The reason for the requested loan are to be found in the theme of Expo 2015, Feeding the Planet, Energy for Life. After a period of controversy, the idea came to nothing. The work remained in Naples. At the beginning of 2016, Caravaggio's 7 Works of Mercy was the center of a diatribe over another possible transfer of the work. The idea was to show the painting in the Quirinal, the residence of the President of the Italian Republic, for the Jubilee of Mercy inaugurated by Pope Francis and conceived as a tribute to the condition of migrants attempting to reach Europe. Once again, the hoped-for move never came about. A group of art historians published an open letter in which they asked the Italian president Sergio Mattarella to prevent the transfer in order to protect the painting and its original context. On June 2, 2016, the Italian president inaugurated the Museum of Trust and Dialogue for the Mediterranean on the island of Lampedusa. The exhibition was based on various objects recovered from shipwrecks of recent years, and in particular the one of October 3, 2013, in which 368 migrants perished off the coast of the Isola dei Conigli. Several screens were installed on the walls showing television images of rescues at sea, while in an inner room, at the center of the exhibition route, was Caravaggio's Sleeping Cupid, painted in 1608 and commonly kept at the Galleria Palatina in Florence. The Uffizi director Hufschmid justified the transfer of the Sleeping Cupid as a generic artistic tribute, I quote, to all the children for whom help did not arrive in time, end of quote, but also as a message of hope for the future. The exhibition ended on October 31, 2016, in a whirl of journalists visiting the island for the occasion. So what position should we take on these types of actions? Should we offer generic praise for the attempt to bring artistic and historic heritage of the past into the present, or should we firmly criticize acts that not only decontextualize paintings, but are also morally impertinent toward the real conditions of suffering experienced by people assisted by the work of NGOs? By embracing one or the other of these two solutions, one actually misses out on the opportunity effectively offered by the construction of a humanitarian Caravaggio to examine the interweaving between the most tragic images of the present day and the iconographic repertoire of Western art. Beyond the physical transfers of artworks mentioned above, is it possible to conceive of displacement of art objects as a useful theoretical and critical paradigm of public engagement? As I'll try to explain, displacement doesn't necessarily coincide with a physical transfer, but it corresponds with the inauguration of a process of analysis and comparison of different images, with the aim of reflecting critically on their respective fields, art history and humanitarian communication. In other terms, is it possible to see in Caravaggio's works certain details that may help us critically understand the evolution of humanitarian visual culture? So let's try to look at the 7 works of mercy from our humanitarian present. Let's try to offer a contribution to the controversial question of the origins of humanitarianism from the perspective of art history. As we know from the Gospel of Matthew and other theological sources, the works of corporal mercy are 7: to feed the hungry, to give water to the thirsty, to clothe the naked, to shelter the homeless, to visit the sick, to visit the imprisoned, to bury the dead. The originality, but one might also say the topicality of Caravaggio's 7 works of mercy seems therefore to reside in a series of movements performed by the artist. First of all, compared to previous iconographies, the painting disrupts the separation of individual works in favor of plasticity and spectacularity of suffering and mercy. In the 7 works of mercy, the duty to shelter the homeless is represented with the figure of a host. With his left hand, he is making a welcoming gesture to a man who appears in front of him. Moving on to the present, this same approach has been adopted by large operational area of UN agencies as well by NGOs that manage multiple camps scattered around the world. When looking at the phenomenon of refugee camps from a long-term perspective, it becomes evident that the offer of a shelter tends to extend into other forms of assistance, which range from distributing basic necessities to providing educational and psychological support. In the 7 works of mercy, the need for water and food are separated. The first is expressed through the reference to Samson, and the second through the shocking breastfeeding figure of Pero, which combines the acts of visiting prisoners and giving food to the hungry. These 2 acts of mercy, whose complementarities experimented with by Caravaggio, also tend to converge in humanitarian iconography, although not exclusively. Think of the monitoring function usually associated with healthcare and moral support that has historically been performed by the Red Cross in battlefields around the world, or the function of public condemnation and appeal for reconciliation performed by organizations such as Amnesty International. The duty to clothe the naked assumes paradigmatic importance. From the point of view of influences, this figure collapsed on the ground was inspired by Michelangelo's naked figures, Dei Nudi, in the Sixtine Chapel. But what distinguishes Caravaggio's twist on it is the fact that such a naked figure is inscribed in a moral dispositive like the works of mercy, a dispositive that can only establish itself and functioning in the presence of a form of life that is entirely qualified by need. With the works of mercy, a figure without a clear social determination, in a certain sense without a habitus, enters the Western visual culture. We know that he is in need, we know that he suffers, but we tend to ignore the reason, whether as a result of an illness, an economic misfortune, or other causes. We could therefore say that Caravaggio's painting invites us to reflect on a paradoxical form of recognition, that situation in which the subject is recognized and assessed precisely because it coincides with what contemporary political philosophy has defined as bare life. As we have seen, Caravaggio explicitly confronts life and death, understood as two aesthetic conditions. He focuses particularly on bodies, which he represents with the same level of detail in both the lower parts, feet, heels, and the upper parts, the faces of the sacred figures. He investigates epidermis and conditions of sensitivity and insensitivity. In many cases, Caravaggio's paintings attempt to represent the very moment in which a body passes from life to death, or miraculously from death to life. The depiction of the exact moment in which this transformation takes place constitutes a challenge to pictorial representation, but it also seems to me to offer some interesting insights into rethinking humanitarian communication and some of its long-standing rhetoric. Looking at images from the archives of the World Health Organization, as well as from reportage by famous photographers and recent humanitarian campaigns, the medical care is represented as an attempt to open up the insensitive body in order to regenerate it in a graceful posture. What, after all, has humanitarian communication been, if not a continuous attempt to represent synthetically, in the instantaneousness of the photographic shot, the process of care and healing? So, which religious legacies, which ideologies tend to hide in the ways in which we still represent the cure or the healing process? But Caravaggio's painting is also an extraordinary repertoire of gesture of pathos. According to the great art historian Roberto Longhi, Caravaggio obtained the religious figures of his masterpieces, drawing inspiration from the gestures of the men and women who roamed the streets of 17th century Rome, Naples, and other cities where he lived. His paintings offers us the opportunity to reflect on the relationship between the spontaneity of the gestures of pathos that emerge in different contexts and how they are appropriated first in the frame of Christian iconography and secondly in humanitarian communication. I'm thinking here of many humanitarian campaigns, but also of photographs of great social impact, such as those awarded every year by the World Press Photo. I limit myself to mentioning the photo taken by Hossein in 1997 in Algeria and promptly renamed in journalistic discourse as the Madonna of Bentala, without taking into consideration the cultural and religious context in which these gestures of pathos took place. Caravaggio's painting is not only made up of suffering bodies and extreme gestures. Anticipating some trends that would characterize the European painting of the 17th century, he was the first to put in the image what we still call the everyday life. This is a cyclical and dilated temporality within which gestures of rest and leisure, even in difficult contingencies, take shape. This is the case of a painting with a religious theme, such as Rest on the Flight into Egypt, painted between 1595 and 1596. In an even more explicit way, the space and time of everyday life emerges in The Musicians, painted in 1597. But an absolutely everyday experience also emerges from the card sharps, painted in 1594 and dedicated to anonymous figures who enjoy playing cards. A photographer like John Vink, to whom I dedicated great attention in my book, seems to have been explicitly inspired by these paintings for his reportage realized between 1987 and 1994 in refugee camps all over the world. I can't show you his photos within this video presentation, but just take a look on the photographer's website. His shots bring out the expressive capacity of individuals who are forced to live as refugees. At the beginning of the talk, I referred to the notion of bare life. Yet Caravaggio invites us to reflect on the fact that even within a refugee camp, there always persists an intersubjective social and political life, and that no life should be conceived as purely naked or denuded of these prerogatives. This is an invitation, if you will, to reconceive the humanitarian visual culture in a participatory case, where the assisted subjects themselves can take on microphone and camera, building new scenarios of meaning and new iconographies. I'd like to be able to go into other examples in greater depth. I limit myself to mentioning once again the painting that was physically transferred to Lampedusa, the Sleeping Cupid, where we observe a naked child against a black background. He is asleep, unable to return our gaze. The setting up of the Lampedusa exhibition did not give us the possibility to look and reflect in a critical and self-critical way, but moving this painting out of its context and observing it with the eyes of today obliges us to come to terms with some of the most problematic aspects of humanitarian visual culture, on the centrality of the figure of childhood, but also on the fact that entire areas of the world have sometimes been subjected to infantilizing representations. An invitation, therefore, also in this case, to question our gaze and to conceive of images that are not based on the asymmetry between the adult and the child, between who is awake and who is asleep. I must set out to conclude. Through the expression displacing Caravaggio, I've taken up a term that has multiple meanings. In the first instance, we can look to the psychoanalytical meaning of displacement, a mechanism that, according to Sigmund Freud, can take on a defensive function and, I quote, whose essence lies in the diversion of the train of thought, the displacement of the psychical emphasis on a topic other than the opening one. End of quote. In the second place, the verb to displace refers to extremely concrete actions. Its proximity with other verbs such as to dismiss, to exile, to deport, is impossible to overlook. To think of displacing as a method for visual culture studies requires first of all becoming aware of the phenomena of repression and deportation in the psychoanalytical and political field. It means also to understand that arts and images have always been part of geographical, moral, and political processes of construction of borders between what belongs to our culture and what is provisionally considered as external, between what is presumed to be properly human and what is not, etc. At the same time, when faced with certain images, what happens is something like an opening toward a multiplicity of visual and conceptual potentialities. Caravaggio and other celebrated masters did not merely represent living bodies and inert objects, but invite us to look at the ways in which they represented both bodies and objects, and thus the ways in which we continue to look at such sensitive issues. Today, more than ever, those who deal with communication are called to confront a self-critical process of decolonization of the gaze. My impression is that opening a confrontation with the tradition of Western art history can be an opportunity to challenge visual culture, thus decentralizing and regenerating the art historical debate itself. Beyond Caravaggio, I look forward to understanding what aesthetic and political challenges come along with the possibility of displacing the wider field of the arts. And I stop here and thank you very much for your attention.
Good afternoon, everybody. I hope you're well. My name is Gilles Furtwängler. I'm a poet and a visual artist living between Lausanne, Switzerland, and Johannesburg in South Africa. I'm here to invite you to participate in a collective artwork. I, myself, mainly work with words, text that I write, but also with found text, found words that I hear and read in my daily life. I then turn these sentences into poems to be read. They are also printed on posters or tarps, painted or turned into sculptures. I'm interested by writing and retelling what I hear, to give it back through art pieces. Our everyday words and thoughts, ways of speaking, of thinking, of learning, of evolving. For the ones who are interested to participate, I'm inviting you to share with me on a guest book page some of your notes, comments, or feedback on the topics presented today. What do you think we can learn in art and from humanitarian work? What are the thoughts you have while listening to today's presentations?
How does art address humanitarian situations? Do you think about relevant works which could make sense for us as a society? How do humanitarians use art to talk about crises? From your point of view, what are the most relevant ways of doing this, to speak about crisis? How can one look at vulnerability? I think this is a big question. Where are the limits between dignity, voyeurism, saviorism, ego, concrete support, and thoughtful gaze? What are, from your point of view, the place of ethics in representing vulnerability?
It's pretty simple to participate. You just need to click on this link and you will be directed to a page where you will be able to post your feedback and comments. My proposition is to build with your words a text around the topics of this symposium. The text will be then designed and published in the book following this symposium. Every contributor will be credited or can decide to stay anonymous. Feel free to give your feedback as if it was a guest book, an ID box, a common brainstorming, or a complaints office. It can be keywords, critical thoughts, long paragraph, short ones. All is accepted. There is also a video uploading option for those who prefer to talk. The link is available from now and will stay active until tomorrow at noon. I am really looking forward to discovering your contribution and working with them. I thank you very much for your participation I'm wishing you a good afternoon. Thank you.
Hello, so my name is Olivier Chow, and I'll be talking about representing the possible trauma and representation in Alfredo Jaar's Rwandan Project. The aim of this paper is to discuss the relation between trauma and representation in the work of Chilean artist Alfredo Jaar, born in 1956, mainly his installations dedicated to Africa, in particular Rwanda. We should take a closer look at how the artist engages with atrocities, in particular genocide. We'll examine how his installations both provoke and disarm our own voyeuristic gaze, which so often underlies our engagement with the spectacle of atrocities. I shall argue that the artist toys with the mechanisms of trauma, reprogramming the shock dynamics and substituting the aesthetics of the wound with the document, which I understand as the contextualization and integration of image and event. In the document, the post-traumatic gaze is both revived and buried, acknowledged and mourned. In the time and space of the document, the viewer can finally encounter, engage with, and be present in the missed encounter of the traumatic event. In order to set up the document, Alfredo Jaar contextualizes the image by recreating a unique environment and public space which collapses traditional separations between object and subject. The view is not external to the work of art or to the fabric of history, but integrated within the frame of the image, often through the use of mirrors, where the viewer becomes a participant within a historical frame of the event staged by the artist. Alfredo Jaar thus expands the double surface of the document by developing time as well as space in order to set up a specific spatiotemporal armature in line with the historical event captured in the frame of the image. In the document, the event becomes an architectural space which can be experienced and visited by the viewer. One such work of art is The Sound of Silence. The Sound of Silence contextualizes the infamous Pulitzer Prize-winning Kevin Carter photograph, first published in the New York Times in 1993. It shows us a child starving on its way to a feeding center in Sudan under the hungry gaze of a vulture. Instead of telling the story of the little Sudanese girl whose fate is unknown, Jaar focuses on the man behind the famous image, on what happens behind the frame. The Sound of Silence sets up the space of the image in a large cube. One of the external sides of the cubic structure is illuminated by a series of blinding white neon lights, violently contrasting with the dark interior of the cube. It takes 8 minutes in this small camera obscura to understand and experience the multiple and interwoven tragedies of the Kevin Carter photograph. The story of Kevin Carter unfolds in writing and silence on the screen. The biographical narrative of the South African freelance photographer is a narrative of failure, soul-searching, and trauma, which enables the viewer to identify and empathize with Carter, who sadly committed suicide in 1994, aged 33. Kevin Carter's narrative culminates in the traumatic encounter with a starving little girl in the Sudanese bush. The cruel subtext lies in the fact that Carter waited 20 minutes watching the little girl crawl in desperation in the hope that the vulture would spread its wings, which it does not, in order to get a better picture. The text is only interrupted once by 4 violent and blinding flashes turned against the viewer. The violent breach of the scopic field reverses the position of the viewer, voyeur, now violated by the flash and victimized like a Sudanese child. Carter's picture then appears furtively on the screen, and the narrative ends with the destiny of the image and suicide of the photographer. The image has only appeared for a fraction of a second, the actual time it took for the image to be recorded, but the frame of its cruel history and destiny will haunt the viewer throughout the rest of the visit. The Sound of Silence manages to stage what Stanley Cohen called the atrocity triangle, which he understands in the following way. In the one corner, victims to whom things are done. In the second, perpetrators who do these things. In the third, observers, those who see and know what is happening. As Stanley Cohen further remarks, these roles are not fixed. On the contrary, they often exchange and rotate amongst the participants of the atrocity triangle. The Sound of Silence collapses the separations between the 3 figures of the atrocity triangle. The photographer as witness is a perpetrator, a predator like the vulture who is waiting for the right moment to strike. But he is, of course, also a victim of his own photograph. He never forgave himself for not assisting the little girl. The ghost of the little Sudanese victim exalted the memory of Kevin Carter until his death, thus turning into a kind of mnemonic monster. The scopic cruelty which sustains our own voyeuristic gaze as witnesses is violently inverted and thrown back at us, and we find ourselves all of a sudden on the receiving end of the peephole, abject and stained by our own voyeuristic gaze mirrored by the screen. The sound of silence, as trap for the post-traumatic gaze, stages and disables the very mechanisms of scopophilia at work within the atrocity triangle. The image in Jaar is thus a site of trauma with its violent breach of the subject's protective shield, which disrupts the psychic order. The traumatic nature of the image is particularly present in his Rwandan Project, which explores the remnants of the Rwandan genocide. In 1994, a few weeks after the end of the genocide, Jaar leaves for Rwanda, where he takes some 3,000 pictures. He spends a lot of time in the company of victims, debriefing survivors. It then takes him 6 years to process the material, attempting to do justice to events and encounters which on many levels cannot be understood nor represented. I quote, "If I spent 6 years working on this project, it was trying different strategies of representation. Each project was a new exercise, a new strategy, and a new failure. Basically, the serial structure of exercises was forced by the Rwandan tragedy, incapacity to represent it in a way that made sense. It is this failure of representation, undeniable when it comes to traumatic visual culture of atrocities, that Jaar seeks not only to show and expose, but to bring about in the radical interface articulated by his installations. In his visual and material strategies dealing with atrocities, Jaar has made a point to avoid the too easy and banal trappings of empathy, which are inevitably attached to the pathos of visual suffering, thus disarming the compulsive identification with the victim, which drives the viewer faced with representation of atrocities. This gesture recalls Claude Nolzmann's approach to the Holocaust, where the scandalous images of the genocide itself were discarded and the simple narratives of those involved privileged. Instead of the horror provoked by the sight of mutilated or dead bodies, the viewer is caught and trapped within the historical nature of the document." Real Pictures is an installation where Jaar's Rwandan pictures are not visible but buried and entombed in blank boxes. Every box bears the factual description and narrative of the photograph, and the visitor is overloaded with a narrative of genocide which contrasts the minimalist aesthetic arrangement of the scene. The image buried in its box tomb is transformed into a document where the image is suppressed and the narrative exposed. One of the narratives reads as follows. Gutete Emerita, 30 years old, is standing in front of the church. She was attending Mass in the church when the massacre began. Killed with machetes in front of her eyes were her husband and her 2 sons. Somehow she managed to escape with her daughter and hid in a swamp for 3 weeks, only coming out at night for food. When she speaks about her lost family, she gestures to corpses on the ground, rotting in the African sun. The boxes are piled onto each other, monumental mass graves of various sizes and heights, but also archive, transforming the museum space into a mausoleum and place of memory, where Jaar's Rwandan photographic experience rests. Real Picture is an obsessive monument dedicated to a traumatic encounter between an artist and witness and the people of Rwanda. Real Pictures is a site of mourning, not only for the victims of the Rwandan genocide captured in the images, but also for the artist's own private Rwanda. In a gesture similar to Claude Nolzmann, who said that he needed to resuscitate the anonymous victims of the Holocaust and kill them a second time in order to accompany them, Jaar revives and buries these traumatic memories, never abandoning them. Alfredo Jaar, through the document, resurrects, objectifies, and engages with the archive of his traumatic memories. In real pictures, the traumatic memories, both acknowledged and mourned, laid bare within the Rwandan archive. The document, as it appears now, also works as a tool and a weapon against trauma, in the sense that the psychic reality of the event is not denied, but acknowledged and ritually buried, a healing gesture which mirrors the work done by psychiatrists working with victims suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD, who are asked during psychological debriefings to factually document the genesis of the traumatic event. While his Rwandan installations are serialized and obey an obvious logic of compulsive repetition, Real Pictures is an attempt to ward off and lay at rest the post-traumatic content of his Rwandan photographic encounters. The most haunting work on Rwanda is probably The Eyes of Gutete Emerita. In The Eyes of Gutete Emerita, the viewer is not directly confronted with the atrocities of the genocide, but is faced with the eyes of Gutete Emerita, the gaze of a survivor whose narrative has been mentioned earlier, and who has been a direct witness to something it is impossible to bear witness to. The aporia of The Eyes of Gutete Emerita is that there is a fundamental disjunction between the narrative of trauma, which can be told but not represented, or can only fail in representation, and her gaze, which has witnessed the genocide but is unable to show it. This disjunction is also present in Field, Road, Cloud, where the legendary beauty of the Rwandan countryside does not show any wounds. Trauma etymologically signifies wound, nor signs of the atrocities which have taken place. Jaar once again manages to disable and to disarm the viewer's coprophilia by refusing us the obscene side of the wound, which is in a way refused by Gutete Emerita and even by Rwanda itself. Alfredo Jaar confronts the viewer's desire and need to see the traumatic wounds with the survivor's need, be it the Rwandan landscape or Gutete Emerita, to live beyond the event. The uncomfortable viewer is left with the impossible task of searching for traces of the horrifying event which was once there but is no longer present. The traumatic gesture is a returning and a revisiting of the event. This is what the viewer both attempts and fails to do. The traumatic nature of this missed encounter is indexed by the hundreds of thousands of serialized slides of The Eyes of Gutete Emerita heaped upon a white neon screen. The traumatic white neon screen, so present in the work of Alfredo Jaar, indexes the emptiness and excess of absence, the excessive and violent white pain of the absent. The post-traumatic gaze of loss, like the buried images of Real Pictures, is here again sculpted into a mass grave or funerary heap, laid bare within a blinding field in a gesture which attempts both to revive and bury at the same time. The powerful and haunting nature of The Eyes of Gutete Emerita lies in the shaming gaze of this missed encounter, which is not only a missed encounter between Jaar and his subject, but a missed encounter between the West and Rwanda. What Alfredo Jaar manages to conjure within the space of the museum is the very experience of our failed engagement with not only certain images or realities, but also the very political fabric that makes those realities possible. In Untitled Newsweek, Jaar displays all the Newsweek covers that appear during the unfolding of the Rwandan genocide. Every cover is accompanied by the historical facts pertaining to the genocide and its monstrous body count, which every week added up another 100,000 additional unreported and anonymous victims. The reality of genocide is absent from the Newsweek covers, which focus instead on, in comparison, trivial Americana, such as the deaths of Kurt Cobain, Jackie Kennedy, the trial of O.J. Simpson, and the high-tech gender gap. It is only in August 1994, after the end of the genocide, that the first Newsweek cover dedicated to Rwanda appears. What the art of Alfredo Jaar tells us is that we have to move away from scopic trappings offered by the sight of traumatic images, which show and excite but do not explain. The spectacle of these images is costly from a psychological perspective. The excessive and overbearing presence of the traumatic image will trigger a process of impossible denial. They will haunt the viewer in return until they are dealt with, that is, acknowledged and mourned. The other danger is apathy, an excessive response similar to shock and also related to trauma. Apathy is when we're no longer able to respond effectively to what we are shown, when we become inured to the pain of others. The document provides an alternative to the scopic trap of atrocities and to the PTSD, shock, apathy continuum by fostering acknowledgement and providing an interface with the missed event, of which the site of the wound is crucially absent. Instead of the negative ontology of trauma, the art of Alfredo Jaar has relentlessly sought to awaken and affirm a positive ontology, that is, a compassionate ethics of presence, a political consciousness oriented towards being present to those who most need our assistance and protection. Thank you very much.
Okay, I think maybe we're live now. Okay, cool. So yeah, technology doesn't always work, but human beings do. So welcome to Ariane, to Julie, to Francesco, to Philippe. It's a great, great pleasure to have you here with us, and to Pierre-Antoine, who is also joining us in this live session. Thank you very much also to Olivier for his great presentation, and now we're going to dive straight into this wonderful, new perspective which you opened up, Ariane, Olivier, and Francesco. I have a trillion questions to ask you. I'm going to dive in, and I look forward to Julie and Philippe to join me in this conversation. Perhaps we could start out, Ariane, with a question to you, which also connects with what you have been discussing, Francesco. And this first question is also one for you, actually, Julie, as Director of Cultural Development of the Art and Design University in Geneva. Ariane, Julie, I'm curious about context. You were discussing, Ariane, in your paper, this idea of interconnectedness and how artists are so connected and how they can enable us to reach to this connection. I would be curious to know how you consider, Ariane and Julie, the opportunity that art schools or contexts can provide to artists when they're training or at an emerging phase of their career, to precisely consider that they are interconnected and that they can bridge different areas and themes and topics. Perhaps Ariane first, how do you consider context in your reflection?
I think context is super important in this world, and we're losing sight of context. And for artists going to art schools to be thinking about context means engaging not only with their artistic practice, but also engaging with, for example, the context of science. Science is proving how interconnected we all are. Physics, for example, very clearly shows how every atom in our body comes from the universe and the beginning of the universe 14.7 billion years ago. And that kind of thinking now is leaking through into theory, which by people like Karen Barad and Donna Haraway, who are talking about how the environment is very important as well. And that is starting to be taught in art schools. But I think context and different contexts and ways of being have to be part of an art school pedagogy now.
And Julie, being this art school here in Geneva, which is the world's capital of humanitarian action, how do you think about this specific context around the artists who are training in your school?
Well, it's very difficult because in a way they know everything. You know, the students they can have access to everything, and so they are very much aware of what is happening. But on the other side, they are remote and they need to experiment and they need to live. They have experience and meet people and have they need to be moved by something very strong and so it's we try to give them now some new courses. We call it a transversality, and we try to set up a program which can give them some tools with such as the one of Donna Haraway, for example, but others too, and they can use it for design or visual arts, and to think more of contemporaneity and vulnerability in a way. But you know, it's yeah. They have theory, they have internet, and I think I'm very much convinced that they need to live something with their own body. So they have to go, and experiment things.
And Francesco and Philippe as well, do you think such tools could be given the other way around to humanitarian workers to better interact, learn from, or experience art?
Yeah.
What would that bring?
Absolutely. I think that humanitarian field, humanitarian values can be assumed as keys for reinterrogating art history, Western archive in a new way. So on one side, not just contemporary art is a form of political and moral engagement, but also art from the past can be considered as such. But if we want to do that, we have on the other side to assume a perspective that is outside the comfort zone of art history. So in order to transform art history and heritage in a form of public engagement, we have to use instruments, tools, and ideas coming from outside this field. So.
And well, Philippe, with your experience from the field, I think what Francesco just said resonates strongly with the conversations we have all the time. But I'm curious to hear how you react to that.
Well, obviously, I feel we are also in a setup which is where we face a shortage of technologies, which is the reality of my colleagues, I have to say first. But yes, indeed, and I think there is still this lack of I don't know if it's understanding, confidence, and so on, because these two fields are looking at each other. I don't know how they interact much, but the papers that were presented this afternoon were really telling in the way that one can help the other. So I don't know if I'm responding exactly to the question, but maybe later on I can bring few examples on more the visionary parts related to what Ariane mentioned. But yeah, I can come back to that after.
Feel free to jump in, guys. I don't want to be the only one asking the questions, but I have so many. One thing very interesting with your paper, Ariane, and yours, Francesco, and also Olivier's, who unfortunately couldn't join us today, is again this idea of context. And Francesco, you you were really talking in your paper how the communication aspect of humanitarian work should be questions in a decolonization perspective, and how we should question how communication is given and transmitted. I'd like to flip things around and ask your point of view on how perhaps we could empower the viewer to displace his or her gaze and to be aware of the context and to question as a viewer. This is a bit what Olivier was saying, the message that's coming towards us, how to decolonize one's own perspective as a viewer. Do you think, what tools do you see? I asked myself what a museum can do in this context, but please.
Yeah, of course. This is a very, very difficult question. I don't have an answer. I can try to say something. Of course, through exhibitions, through meetings, and this is a way for empowering the viewers and to decentralize, criticize, reflect on the way of seeing the relationship between what we are and what the other are. And at the same time, what I want to say here, because I don't want to generalize, because I'm not an expert of decolonization or humanitarian communication in general, is the simple fact that, of course, decolonization is one of the most important term in this present time, and we risk to assume, employ this term as a sort of arm, as a sort of, we decolonize, so we just have to, don't look at Caravaggio, don't look at our Western tradition, just forget this, okay. I think that if we really want to decolonize or decentralize or criticize our perspective, what is necessary is to understand how deep need to be developed such attitude. So in a certain sense, religious iconographies persist implicitly in our communications. And so if we really want to decolonize or invent something new, regenerate our vision, we need to learn how to look at images, the different layers of iconographies and representations, not just of suffering, because Caravaggio didn't just represent suffering bodies, but also playing. This is my view. Art history and the displacement of art history outside his comfort zone can help us to work on the different layers of visual culture and, of course, humanitarian communication as well.
Mm-hmm. Julie, Philippe,
yeah. I really like this this methodology you propose, and I'm pretty much convinced that this could bring something really like an enrichment of what we know about this this artist, and I think that it can help us to understand how we think and how we look at the world in general, and so it's, yeah, I really like it. And I was thinking of an art historian, a colleague. She's studying Nicolas Poussin, the paintings of Nicolas Poussin. She's looking at it in an ecological perspective, and it's really interesting to see how we just domesticate the landscape, and how all this organization of the nature And this really helps us to understand why we are here now with this all climate change and things like that. So yeah, I think it's a good perspective, and we should learn from it. Thank you for the conference anyway.
I can add that this is very timely. The International Committee of the Red Cross has just launched a study to review the way we portray affected people. So this is definitely a moment where I think in humanitarian history, we will see suddenly a change on who is the person who holds the lens and what we want to see and from which perspective. I think that things are changing also in the way we have the different narrative around vulnerabilities, around humanitarian problems, humanitarian issues. So yeah, it's very timely and very to the point.
We often think of humanitarian action and art as two very different fields, and as we said in the introduction of this conversation at the very beginning of the symposium, that they seldomly work with one another or work with one another in very rigid ways that can be questioned and opened up. Ariane, I'm thinking of you here because in your presentation and the way you see the artist, there is this sense of agency and the sense of having an impact and changing, which very much connects, in my understanding, to many humanitarian values or many reasons why humanitarian workers do what they do. How do you see this connection on the level of values between artists and humanitarian action?
I think there is really true alignment in the sense that artists and humanitarians are both working and looking at identity, they're looking at dignity, they're looking at communicating empathetically, they're looking at development and creating new futures in a positive way, and how issues affect human beings and touching people's human beings and hearts. So I think there's a really critical and strong alignment in both.
Mm-hmm. And what could the difficulties or the perils be of that relationship from your point of view?
There are always multiple difficulties and perils. I mean, in history, art has also been used as propaganda and as anti-humanitarianism. So even the great classic Battle Potemkin, Sergei Eisenstein, that's a propaganda piece. But the problems can be, for example, getting too close to the horror of an issue that the artist cannot get out of the horror of it and cannot see the way of communicating out of it and developing further. So that's one way. And the other way around is humanitarianism actually instrumentalizing art to the point that the art becomes, stops touching your heart and soul. And I think that's the great thing about art. It transcends just being visual. It is about all your senses and your intuition, your imagination, and triggering empathy so that you connect even to people, places, and issues you have no connection with.
Can I add something, jumping into the discussion? I think that on both sides, the opportunistic use of a situation of an artist is where we will see pretty quickly there is a lack of genuine or honesty from both sides, and this is something that you can't lie around that. We know some artists who just are touched by a situation and it has no sense in their whole work, and they started to pick up something and doesn't sound, genuine. And often what I see from my perspective of understanding some of the situations. Their view is partial, lacks some of the subtleness or the complexity of a situation, and the other way around. And here I confess I used to do that, which is indeed the use of an artist for, I will say, communication purposes. It's not a bad word, but somehow you need something, you are lack imagination, and you commission an artist. So I think the power of an artist in her or his own thinking is like shrinking totally, and there is too many barriers on that to have something powerful.
Mm-hmm. Is that, Julie, do you think this is why many young artists or artists who are being trained here in Geneva and anywhere around the world sometimes shy away from these themes and these topics because it feels just too complex or too much? I mean, how do you address these themes with them?
Well, you know, the young students, they always start to with their own life, their own biography. So they start from this, and afterwards they understand that a very specific part of their life can be an interest for have an universal interest.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe, you know, the death of a father or whatever. And so what we know is that it's much more important to or relevant to talk about themselves than of the world directly. And so they have to understand what is happening through their own story, and this is how they arrive to this very big questions, you know. But of course, it's difficult, and it's very impressive, and you know. But listening to you all, I was thinking of one art piece I saw. I think it was quite a long time ago at Tate Modern in London, and it was the piece of Doris Salcedo. Maybe you know her, this very famous Colombian artist, and she did this crack on the floor, on the ground of the big hall of Tate Modern, and it was just something about border, something about two countries. This idea of being together, or the impossibility of living together, and the violence of it. And it was very simple, but at the same time, I was walking there, and it was, you know, so moving. And sometimes you don't need much. And if you go now to Tate Modern, you can see it, because they had to, you know, to fix it afterwards. And yeah,
Yeah, you don't need much.
Say a lot.
Mm-hmm. You don't need much, and sometimes you can also just grasp complexity through other means of comprehension, such as emotions, the body, togetherness, space. I mean, there's so many ways to dive deep into that. And therefore, Francesco, I have another very simple question for you. You were talking about, at one point, what you were saying really resonated with a project I'm working on with my colleagues. We're curating a big show on the photography collections of the International Red Cross and Red Crescent. We're looking at millions and millions of images from the archives, and we're trying to understand if there is such a thing as a visual grammar of humanitarian action, and how this has evolved through history and how it is still there in today's presentations. You were talking at one point about how affected people could perhaps disrupt the prevailing iconography, and how different perspectives in the field or from people who are directly concerned by what's going on could be different. My question to you is, how do you think that medium itself, photography, for example, how as a language, as a medium itself, it carries with it an entire history and visual culture, even if you're not from the normalizing predominant cultural code, can you free yourself from the medium itself? I mean, is photography always this Western thing and it will always be? That's the question I'm asking myself every day in this project, but I'm curious to hear you.
I understand your question is very interesting because, as you know, Susan Sontag, who wrote about the representation of suffering, wrote also on photography. And in a certain sense, she identified in photography a problem in itself, a political and moral problem in itself. And obviously, in English, to shoot means a lot of things. So as displacing means a lot of things. And so this is a starting point for each reflection on what I propose to call a humanitarian visual culture. But this is for me the starting point, because the risk, if we just limit ourselves to talk about the medium, is that we never look at the images. The singularity of each photo define the potentiality of photography and the limits of photography. So in a certain sense, I understand and I agree with Sontag. But on the other side, I think that we also have to consider each image, each photograph in itself, so as to analyze and the layers, the iconographic layers, and finally, of course, criticize and try to redefine. And this is my point of view, but this is also a point of view in a certain sense based on an assumption, that is the idea that in a certain sense, Caravaggio, one can say, invented photography before photography, because we have always a tendency to put the media on a linearity, on a chronological linearity. But in a certain sense, media have never been invented. They always existed beyond themselves. So Caravaggio, of course, he didn't invent the object or the technology, but he invented the snapshot. Mm-hmm. If you look at his paintings, he invented the very idea to focus on the moment, the instant between two different states. So this is why he is interesting for our investigation on humanitarian photography or reportage and so on.
Well, we definitely need more Caravaggio in our lives then.
Yeah, of course.
Philippe, Julie, do you have another final question for our wonderful guests this evening? All good, Philippe?
Well, jumping on a little bit another topic where the question of anticipation, I think, is very interesting in what Ariane mentioned. And in my own perspective, I'm really engaging, trying to engage with artists who can represent things that are not so tangible yet. We spoke about suffering, of course, but in a digital world where some of the way war is conducted or will be conducted, there is here a huge space for engaging and discussing and working with artists, because they can put an emotion, a sensation on something that we read on a daily basis, such as surveillance and so on. And the exhibition she curated at the Hack it was very telling, because one could feel what it is to be surveilled, and I think that's I hope a path we can also further explore.
Ariane?
Yes, I think that, and also there's a really interesting, well, interesting in inverted commas, relationship between the advances in technology and war itself. And the two are very closely aligned. And then you have artists using technology and some of the cutting edge technology to actually criticize, interrogate, and question that very development for humanitarian reasons, like in the exhibition at Heck, as you mentioned, which is now going to Eindhoven. The minute you entered the exhibition, you were surveyed already and you were already assessed by cameras. And when you came out of the exhibition on panels, it told you how you felt. But that was very limited technology. And the artists were showing this. It's very biased technology because it can only recognize white faces. And as the exhibition also showed, it can only recognize happiness with 100% accuracy. So questioning and interrogating and investigating technology is becoming even more and ever more important, as you said, Philippe, as we're accelerating in terms of the way war is actually carried out and the impact on people.
Well, thank you very much for that, Ariane, and for this wonderful conversation. We'll keep it to this for today. We have so many more topics to cover, and we'll continue next week on May the 11th at 4 p.m. and everything will be perfect with internet on that day, I can tell you that. And the theme will be engaging. So different perspective again on this complex relationship between artists and humanitarian workers. Thank you so much, Ariane. Thank you so much, Francesco. Thank you to Olivier as well, who wasn't able to join us in the end, and Julie, Philippe, on 2 more adventures next week. Thank you very much. Bye.
Bye-bye.